On November 18, 2013, at the border between Southern California and Mexico, an incident occurred that later made headlines across the United States. It cost the country's government $1 million, but that was not the highest price paid for this case. On November 18, 2013, around 6:20 p.m., a young man came into the view of cameras at the American-Mexican Customs. He confidently headed towards the so-called simplified inspection meant for those who cross the border multiple times a day. For example, such simplified inspection is intended for people who live in Mexico but work in California for various reasons. However, it was this young man who caught the attention of the Customs Service. The young man's name was Cruz Velazquez, and he was 16 years old at the time. He told the customs officers that he was going to visit a friend for a couple of days. But his bag aroused the interest of the Customs Service. As a result, he was asked to undergo an additional baggage inspection. During the inspection, a customs officer noticed that the young man started to become noticeably nervous. He kept looking around and his voice started to tremble. It seemed excessively suspicious, so the customs officer decided to send the young man to the officers who were responsible for a more thorough examination of belongings and questioning of suspicious passengers. On that day, the duty officers were Adrian Perlon and Valerie Baird. First, they checked the young man's documents, and they had no questions about them. Then they proceeded to inspect his luggage. Officer Baird opened the young man's bag, and besides his clothes, there were 2 bottles containing a certain liquid that raised suspicion among the officers. A significant number of narcotics is smuggled from Mexico to the United States annually, often through smugglers disguising them as something legal. Not long before that day, the Customs Service received information that cartels could transport methamphetamine dissolved in liquid form. The officers suspected this could be one such case, but the young man claimed it was just apple juice. At that moment, officers Adrian Perlon and Valerie Baird decided to deviate from standard procedure and play the young man's own game. According to protocol, in cases of suspicion regarding the presence of narcotics and liquids, food or similar items, the Customs Service should confiscate the suspicious objects and conduct an immediate test for the presence of narcotics. However, instead of following protocol, the officers, with smiles on their faces, offered the young man the opportunity to prove that there was nothing illegal in the liquids by taking a couple of sips from the bottles. The young man had no choice but to comply. He knew what was in the bottles, so his sips were hesitant. The officers also understood what was in the bottles. However, instead of adhering to the standard protocol, they continued playing the young man's game. Therefore, right after the young man quickly attempted to twist the cap on one of the bottles, Agent Valerie Baird told him to take another sip. They were curious to see how far he would go to hide the truth. And at some point, they themselves went too far in this dangerously risky game. Just 2 minutes after the initial sips, Officer Adrian Perlon, knowing it was dangerous for the teenager's health, with a smile on his face, suggested that he take 2 more sips of what appeared to be apple juice. The young man realized he had no way out, but he also understood that each subsequent sip could be his last, so his sips became less and less confident. Nevertheless, he continued trying to prove that the bottles contained nothing more than apple juice. The officers already knew they wouldn't let him go. They checked his documents once again. At that moment, the first signs of discomfort appeared. The young man started sweating profusely, his body began to tremble slightly, and he grew increasingly nervous. The customs officers then conducted a personal search of the young man, but found nothing prohibited in his clothing. However, they were convinced that he was clearly involved in something. Their final doubts were dispelled by a customs dog trained to detect drugs. It indicated that the young man had come into contact with illicit substances. Subsequently, he was handcuffed and taken to a security room for further interrogation. Approximately half an hour had passed since he took the first sip from the bottle. The young man was led to the security counter for the necessary paperwork, and those around him noticed that something was definitely wrong. Officer Valerie Baird, the woman who initially offered him the first sip, checked his body temperature, which felt extremely high to the touch. The young man started screaming in Spanish, "My heart! My heart!" He was writhing in pain, screaming louder and louder. Only then did the officers call for medical assistance. By the time the ambulance arrived, the young man's body temperature had reached 41 degrees Celsius. He was immediately transported to the nearest hospital, where, approximately 2 hours after his first sip, he died from a drug overdose. The bottles the young man had carried indeed contained methamphetamine. 16-year-old Cruz had recently been recruited by a cartel, and this was his first attempt at drug smuggling. Cartels intentionally choose underage girls and boys for smuggling because, in case of border apprehension, they face only a few months in prison and subsequent deportation. Most likely, the young man feared not the relatively lenient punishment, but what awaited him back home if he failed the mission. That's why he decided to engage in this deadly game with the customs officers. Officer Valerie Baird, who had suggested the first sip, was also taken to the hospital as she believed she needed medical assistance due to her contact with the bottle containing methamphetamine. Ironically, she found herself in the room next to Cruz's and heard all his dying screams. After the incident, an investigation was conducted, during which both Valerie Baird and Adrian Perlon denied offering the young man to take those life-threatening sips. They insisted that he did it voluntarily. Despite the clear evidence from surveillance camera recordings contradicting their claims, they faced no consequences for the incident.
I never asked him to, he volunteered to, and I believe I gestured to him to go ahead.
You told him to go ahead and drink on more than one occasion, did you not?
No.
And you're sure of that?
I'm sure.
As expected, Cruz's family portrayed him as a smart and kind young man who simply fell into bad company. Later, they managed to obtain a $1 million compensation from the US government for Cruz's death, believing it was due to the negligence of the customs officers, Perry and Baird. In their opinion, the 16-year-old boy's death was entirely the responsibility of those officers. However, many believe that the young man was ultimately responsible for his own death, and his choice at the customs was just a culmination of decisions he made earlier when he decided to become part of the large Mexican drug empire.